10 years ago, you probably just have a handful of organizations that would call them studios. Now there's over 800 globally that they're working to bring innovation to market this way. So we're part of that trend.
What is a corporate venture studio, and how is it impacting the future of manufacturing? We're going to hear it straight from Joel Reed of Premier Labs as to how they're making an impact right here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, Joel, it's been 3 years since you and I last chatted on camera.
Time flies quickly, right?
And you're on to a new adventure here
That's
at
right.
Premier Labs. So we're going to talk about that in a second, but before we jump in, we were having some chatter beforehand. And in the manufacturing happy hour style, if possible, we like having these conversations over a drink. Obviously, we're doing this at your offices today, but you were talking about a place called the Abbey in Lawrenceville, which is not only what sounds like a good spot to grab a Belgian beer, but also like a little bit of a hub, if you will, for where folks in the robotics community meet and hang out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's in Lawrenceville, which is on the far end of a robotics row, from the Strip District into Lawrenceville, so right there on Butler Street. And it seems to be one of those gatherings where if you're there for lunch or for a drink, you're going to bump into someone, from the robotics industry. Locomation used to be right down the street. Aurora for a time until they moved into their larger building, and also in that area is where the robotics factory is now.
Yeah. So all a lot of the robotics companies, the folks that are involved, they're all concentrated in that area. So that's kind of the local bar in the area.
It's one of them. Yeah.
One of them. Okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you can make a little crawl out of it, but for all practical purposes,
it's a great idea.
Yeah, we'll pretend we're having this conversation at the Abbey and then maybe jump into somewhere else. But right before we sat down for this, I was listening to our interview from about 3 years ago, and I was asking you, is Pittsburgh like the hub of the robotics world? And you're like, no. In general, it's just the hub of the world. So
is that what I said?
That is what you said.
Yeah.
That is what you said. Do you remember why you said?
Well, did I say it was the robotics capital of the world at the time?
I think you did.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that was there.
Yeah. Well, that was the point. It's a robotics capital. Some of that is aspirational, but it was also meant to create a conversation in the industry. For folks in the industry at that time and even today, most people knew that it was 3 major centers within the United States that were leading robotics development and commercialization. The ones that are better known are Boston and San Francisco. But all of those people directly involved in the industry knew Pittsburgh was the 3rd.
Yeah.
But I think if you get outside of that, maybe speaking to some of your target customers, speaking with investors or people that you might be recruiting for those businesses, they wanted to know why were we located in Pittsburgh. And that created headwinds for us from a business perspective. So when a small group of us had an opportunity with the Pittsburgh Robotics Network, we decided to make a bold statement. And many times when we do that, like at a conference, people will be like, why is Pittsburgh the robotics capital of the world? And you remind them or you tell them about all the great things that are happening, how a lot of these technologies had originated in Pittsburgh and the 125 businesses that are there. And we would either get the reaction of, you know what, you're right, I've done business. That's a reminder of what's happening there, or I had no idea. And because of all of what you're telling me is that makes a lot of sense. So we needed to get the word out.
Well, you made a great comparison in that conversation. You had said, hey, years ago, Pittsburgh developed as an industrial town because of its abundance of raw resources. And the way you described it was our differentiating raw resource today is the engineering talent that is rich and abundant in Pittsburgh. So I thought that was a nice parallel, bringing us from where Pittsburgh was to where Pittsburgh is today.
Yeah, and I'm really happy that we're having this conversation around Premier today, because the next big step Pittsburgh has to take to really live up to that aspiration is commercial development, right? And so now what I'm involved in is coming more from the market and less from technology and innovation. So we're talking to customers about real problems and how these maturing technologies can now address those problems.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I want to talk about Premier and Premier Labs specifically. Another thing you had mentioned during that time was, the culture here is about identifying real problems and then finding solutions, bringing them to the real world. So How is Premier Labs doing that? It's very unique to see ultimately like a robotics and automation solutions company having an in-house incubator like Premier Labs. That's how I understand it, but describe it as if we're hanging out at the Abbey right now.
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is correct you and say that we're a studio.
A studio?
Yes.
Okay.
And
all
so
right.
it's a corporate venture studio.
Okay.
It is a relatively new concept or new model for bringing technology into places. It's earlier stage than incubators and accelerators.
Okay.
In that we are identifying problems first, applying the appropriate solution, and then launching companies directly from an early concept. So it's market driven, it's customer driven, and a lot of people, when we talk about this, it's really not that novel, which is you get to learn a customer's problem before you actually start designing the solution. And what that does is that helps ensure product market fit from the very beginning. A lot of technology founded companies or with tech founders, they have created some new piece of technology or a new method, which in many cases can change industries, launch whole new product categories, but more often than not, they have trouble finding out where they actually fit in a marketplace or in an application, or how they meet the requirements of a customer. And that's why 9 out of 10 ventures actually fail.
Sure.
So it's a very messy business. It's very difficult, and it's a highly risky way to invest, from an innovation perspective. So this is a different model.
Yeah.
And it has actually shown higher rates of success, so 30% more successful than venture-backed companies. 84% of studio-founded companies go on to a venture round, and then they end up having higher rates of return because we're putting more time up front validating the customer need and the requirements, and which gives us a better go-to-market strategy. There is a little bit of a trade-off because we do spend a little bit more time up front, but that is a studio. 10 years ago, you probably just have a handful of organizations that would call them studios. Now there's over 800. Globally that are working to bring innovation to market this way. So we're a part of that trend.
I like that clarification. This is the first time I'm learning about a studio being earlier stage. It's market customer driven, so that way, as you said, you've got that product market fit right from the beginning, which any conversation you have with someone involved in venture companies, that is constantly, from my discussions, the biggest struggle I'm hearing is getting that identified. And as you mentioned, why there are so many failures in that space.
Yeah, I think somewhere 70% of companies fail because of a lack of product market fit.
So I guess that does go back to my original question then. Why is Premier Automation, how does this fit into Premier Automation then?
Sure.
Because this does still seem like something very unique for a company that's ultimately delivering robotic systems, SCADA systems, drive systems, you name it, right? This still feels like a unique fit. So why do it?
So the general initiative is not all that unique. I know we've seen each other at conferences. One in particular, Automate, has a high number of systems integrators that go to it. When I was at it this past year, you might see the systems integrator in one booth, and right next to it is this really innovative company. And what you find out is that integrator actually developed that concept and is trying to commercialize it. What happens with systems integrators, they're brought in to solve discrete and many times one-time needs, right? So project-based. But because of those deep relationships with a lot of their customers, and in this case, industrial customers, they see what those core problems are, and they might solve them one time. But what they also see is when they're happening multiple times. So they start seeing trends, and then they see them across different clients, and then they can see them across an industry segment. And the entrepreneurs among that group will say, let's go ahead and build a product, give it a name, build a company around it, and commercialize it. The problem is that service providers are fundamentally different than product companies. They just think differently. They're built differently. The business incentives are completely different. So what you see most of the time are those that have an attached product. But they get busy with their core clients, and then they're unable to give the product company the attention it deserves.
Sure.
So I'd say we're a little bit unique that we've made a full commitment to create a separate and distinct organization called Premier Labs. We're affiliated with Premier Automation, and we rely on many of the benefits of Premier Automation, but we operate independent of Premier Automation. And it's led by a group of investors. It has initial capital, and we ultimately, have a process and the ability to decide, ultimately what we invest in. But because of the relationship with Premier Automation, we, from the very beginning, have access to resources that many startup companies do not have, which is understanding of a market, access to customers, equipment, technology, engineers with extensive experience about the customers, that we're working with, in addition to a lot of the back office support, right? So admin, sales and marketing. We can even take some early concepts and leverage the sales force of Premier Automation to be able to start having customer conversation. Many times that takes years for startups to develop, if they ever develop at all. So it gives us a real distinct advantage in getting a company started.
I was going to say, I think I have a much better understanding now. You're operating as two separate entities, but they can leverage all of the infrastructure that's already there. The customers, the admin, the back office, all the equipment that's out there that they can do their work on. That makes a lot more sense.
And I want to key off of something that you just said. You said they. Okay. So from the very beginning, they is us.
Oh, okay.
So we are actually working closely with Premier's team to develop the early concepts. So it's not necessary. Many times we don't have a team or an entrepreneur in place. So this is a trade-off, right? So this creates something that we actually have to address, in development of a company that we ultimately want to launch. But let me say first that it's really interesting because in the early parts of talking to a customer and developing the early concepts, we behave more like a systems integrator. We truly want to understand at the core what the customer needs, understand the requirements, understand what the constraints and the limitations are of entering into that application or workflow area. But over time, we'll transform ourselves onto the product side. And we'll be more product focused and start thinking about how this scales, how this applies across a diverse customer set. But back to the team, we are the team on day one.
Okay.
Together with Premier's engineers and Premier's sales team and their marketing group. But what we're doing in parallels, we're developing a network of advisors, entrepreneurial advisors, investment advisors, market advisors. And it's kind of like a walk-run strategy, which is, we're working with people that could potentially be qualified to come in and run the company. So we think at this point, we're going to look more for founding managers rather than vision and tech-driven founders of a company, right? So we will validate that product market fit, and then we look for people who have experience in that area, that have the media credibility with the customers, and who might have some execution or operational experience to be able to build those companies. But it's still a risk, right? And we acknowledge that, because the people do matter.
Well, I think this is it's every time I ask a question, I feel like it's an even more unique and differentiated model, because it's not like a Y Combinator where you're bringing in a class of entrepreneurs that all have an idea. As you said, when I'm referring to the companies that are part of this, it's Premier, but as you're building this out, you have advisors, and you're looking for the people that could come in and be the manager or the founder, whatever that would be. But you've kickstarted that process for them, and then you pull in the people afterwards.
That's correct.
Very cool.
It is very cool.
I mean,
I'm really happy to be doing it.
Well, I think the easiest way to kind of like package this all together is, can you describe how this is playing out in a story or an example, whether it's a real one that's already taking place or one that you could see taking place?
Yeah, first I'll start with the big picture. When we started in December of 23, and by the way, the concept came from the group of founding members of Premier Labs, which included Mike Ganeers, the president of Premier Automation. And so, there were others that saw this trend happening and saw the vision for building a corporate venture studio. And then, so then we spent 6 months, kind of working out the processes, and as we've been saying, building the plane. But we've been flying the plane since day one. Which is a typical entrepreneurial pursuit. So almost in the first week or two, once we kickstarted this, we came inside of Premier Automation and said, talk about all the ideas that you had in your head. Talk about all of the things that you hear across the customers. And so we built a pipeline. And almost immediately, we had a pipeline of 20 to 30 ideas. And then we started applying our process of kind of vetting them at a very early, early point of the process. And then we're following, sort of a lean startup approach to, go out and do customer interviews, validate the problem, build a problem statement, start thinking about some concepts, whether we're brainstorming that internally or we're hearing it from the market. And then building that up, validating it again with the customers through our interviews, and then we're going to go and build an actual proof of concept. It could be working, it could be a little bit simulated, it could be conceptual, and then take that back to the marketplace. So we have 3 or 4 active projects right now.
Okay.
We call them projects at this stage.
Okay.
But ultimately, when we see that we've reached a kind of a threshold of due diligence, we'll go back to our founding managers and say, we have a company that we want to bring into the marketplace. And we have the ability to seed that company. So a company will be seeded both with capital from Premier Labs, but also in-kind contributions from Premier Automation. And that could be anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million worth of total contribution to launch a company. So it's kind of like baking, the idea, and then when we know that it's ready to go out, then we'll go ahead and make it. And the founders, the members, the operating members, look at it as an investment. So we have to hit on some of the key criteria, for a viable and scalable company, and that kind of holds our feet to the fire. So, four primary right now. I think one that is, a good representative example. Much of the robotics industry is trying to use industrial arms to do a number of tasks.
Yeah.
One of them is called grinding and finishing. So if you're very familiar with it, they're doing it in an automobile, they're doing it in aerospace. They're doing it in major manufacturing sites. And so this was one of the ones that we saw as a really excellent opportunity.
Yeah.
And the way we look at it is that, and I think this is an important distinction, and it gives us an advantage. Since we're not a tech-driven company, we don't feel like we have to automate the entire thing with this leading or bleeding edge technology. So we really look for the best overall solution to be able to solve the customer problem. What that has evolved into almost immediately is that we look for collaborative applications where humans are still involved in the work.
Yeah.
Right? So we're not going to look at an industrial robot and a software platform to take, and in this case, we're looking at manufactured products like steel casted parts that when they come out, they have all of this excess material with very difficult geometries and difficult contours, that the state of the technology is not there to be able to just put that down in front of a robot and have it clean it up completely. People are trying with various levels of success, but the industry was really clamoring for this type of solution because it's one of the hardest jobs. Anytime somebody's new and they're hired into a manufacturing plant, that's the job they get.
It's not a grinder. It's not a glamorous job either.
And it does require a certain skill level and level of experience. But we're trying to marry the intuition and the experience of a human operator, with the predictability and the precision and the speed, of an industrial robot. So that's a good example. I'll give another interesting example that I think highlights a point. We had, of one of our 30 ideas, we had someone say, when operators are working at their workstation, one of the things that they're responsible for, if something's going wrong, if there's a fire, if the machine's not running as it's been configured, you probably know the concept, you hit an e-stop, right? And there are times where you just have to really intervene and stop. But operators will wander from their stations, right? They either have to be looking up and down the line, or quite simply, they take a restroom break, right? Or maybe for some reason they are not incapacitated, but at least they're distracted, from their job. And so someone says, we need an autonomous e-stop button. We need a smarter e-stop button. We looked at that, and it is a need within the marketplace. But when you start looking at the business model, if you're building a physical device that has autonomous capabilities and maybe some biometrics built in and so on and so forth, we did not necessarily see the type of market opportunity, for that product category. But in having those interviews, we found something much better. And we're actually working on a solution to be able to solve, to be able to assist operators in the jobs that they have to do to be able to scale what they do, to give them a greater capacity. And as one person said, no one's going to be 100% undistracted in their job. And so we're just providing tools to those operators to be able to help the managers be able to ensure greater throughput, less downtime, higher capacity, less maintenance, be able to predict types of maintenance issues. So we're just freed up when we go and talk to the customer. We might think we're going to be building one thing, but we end up building something either entirely different, or we can evolve that concept to truly meet what the market needs.
I'm glad you've outlined a couple different examples of how this plays out. One of my last questions here is actually a two-part question. There's a Pittsburgh part of this question and a non-Pittsburgh
I love
part.
the Pittsburgh part.
Yeah, we'll start with the Pittsburgh part. We started this conversation by talking about what makes Pittsburgh such a hub for technology, robotics, etc. So in this case, is this what Premier Labs is doing? How is it uniquely positioned to succeed in a place like Pittsburgh? And then I'll get to the second part right after that.
Two of Pittsburgh's greatest strengths, both legacy and current, are manufacturing and robotics, right? But it's also one of the industries where we're seeing a relatively low adoption rate as compared to other industries. We're probably seeing more robotics and AI, definitely in warehousing and logistics, right? That's one of the main industries that has adopted this technology and started leveraging it with Kiva, now at Amazon Robotics, and now a slightly mature industry of autonomous mobile robots for material handling, mobile manipulation or manipulation robots for doing picking and stuff like that. But manufacturing outside of automobile manufacturing really has had a low adoption rate. So it's something that our region was quite aware of, and we're trying to figure out how to increase that adoption rate. And then where Premier plays is in helping keeping legacy systems running, keeping them optimized, updating them with the latest technologies without having to completely replace an entire, many of our competing economies have the luxury, such as in China, that they'll build a brand new facility, brand new factory, from the ground up with all the latest technologies. We are still leveraging, technology that's 50 to 70 years old, which allows us to be capital efficient, in our operations. But this is where Premier plays, is in being able to optimize all of those types of systems and even help upgrade those machines as well. So this is where we see a great deal. There's this gap between what's coming out of the universities and CMU, being one of the leading universities in the world. That's really important to be able to drive new industries like autonomous, vehicles, as an example. But they haven't quite gotten into the trenches, of batch manufacturing, environments,
right,
and see where those opportunities are. So that's where we play. And so I think Pittsburgh is the ideal location, or one of a handful of locations in the country that has the manufacturing history, has access to many of those facilities, from a geographical perspective. But to have a company like Premier Automation that exists here because of Pittsburgh's rich history in industry. And I'm sure you'll learn about it later, but Premier grew up from this lineage, that has included, organizations like Westinghouse, that created generations worth of engineers. And so we look for those areas and those gaps where we can apply those technologies kind of from a ground up perspective.
So the other half of this question is, a lot of our listeners, viewers of this interview are going to be across the United States and beyond. So what advice would you give to manufacturing leaders out there to not necessarily replicate Premier Labs per se, but replicate some of the mission that's there to aid manufacturing in their areas as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure I need to give advice. As I've started talking to a lot of these, what we would call traditional manufacturing industries, I've been in this now for 25 years, and I've been kicked out of. I've had appointments, and I've either not been let in or kicked out because they knew a robotics person was coming. That's no longer the case. They are aware of the technologies that are out there. The need is there. I think there are two levels. I think for the automation engineers and the industrial engineers that are looking for solutions, it's again, it's to experiment, right? And to open up the mind. I think what we represent now is kind of a new approach, that there are the heavily marketed solutions that come out of universities with fundamentally innovative new technologies. I think take a good strong look at those and see how they could fit, because many are. But I think many aren't living up to their promises, right? So I think maybe look at something like what Premier Labs and Premier Automation does, and others like us, to see how, what's the incremental step to get to the promised land, where we want to get. If I were speaking to the managers and the corporate offices of them, is start allocating the capital, right? There's this mentality called break fix, which is when things break, we'll fix them. We really can get ahead of that. And if we're really going to onshore and bring back manufacturing to the U.S., we're going to have to start seeding some of these technologies, into our operations, making those investments. We're not going to have to build brand new factories, but I think the break fix mentality is not going to help us long term.
Well, I appreciate the thorough, thoughtful answer with a very direct allocate capital as concrete action. My final question for you is a bit more of a personal career question. You've had a very accomplished career up to this point. You've led companies. You were with the Pittsburgh Robotics Network recently. What are you hoping to accomplish here at Premier Labs? Why is this the right next step in your journey?
I think it's something new, right? And I think we're now seeing that gap come narrow, between manufacturing and technology. So I hope to be a part of that. And I'm really thrilled to be a part of Premier Automation, which has had a history of innovative thinking. It may not be apparent to people who live in the innovation world, but they really have. They've moved from being a distributor to being an expert in industrial drives, then moving into automation, and then taking over groups of people that were building robotic solutions. And so it really is kind of an integrated approach. Part of the work that I did at the Pittsburgh Robotics Network, there was a federal program that came into the region, and it was, how do we get this technology into our industries faster? How do we enable the adoption of the technologies and solve some of these problems? So if I could be a small part of that, that's what I'm interested in doing.
Well, it's always good catching up with you, Joel.
I always enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll need to do this over a beer at the Abbey next
You promise?
time. How about deal? Yeah, that round's on me.
Okay.
So thanks for jumping on.
No, thank you. You're welcome.
Cheers.
Yeah.